Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel simply is Discerning What is True. And unfortunately, I've had an issue again with this deal with a title. It's supposed to be Fundamentalism and American Culture, the Shaping of the 26th Century Evangelicalism from 1870 to 1925. So, who are the fundamentalists? We could talk about real quick here, which would be what groups were involved, what particular colleges were involved. Well, we know that probably two of them were involved for sure, maybe three or four. One would be, which is no longer around, it's defunct, is Tennessee Temple, which is located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The other one would be Bob Jones University. And then you would probably have Dallas Theological Seminary and Grace Theological Seminary. Dallas, naturally, Dallas, Texas. Grace Theological Seminary is located in Winona Lake, Indiana, which is near Warsaw, Indiana. And I should know a little bit about that because simply as some of the churches I went to as a young boy was involved with these two major groups. That is, I went to a private Christian school that basically were those that had been taught either at Tennessee Temple or at Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. But also the next church, not the next church, but the next church, actually, it was a Grace Brethren Church, which their seminary is located in Winona Lake, Indiana. And it's part of the Brethren Church, Grace Brethren is, but it's not, I'm trying to remember, it's not part of the Plymouth Brethren. Well, they split off. That's what happened in 1930, so to speak, as I recollect. And it's critical that people understand. And then it just seemed to balloon in all kinds of areas. It eventually got into Methodist churches, Baptist churches. But like I said, a lot of it's in independent Baptist churches too, you see. And what's happened is, I'm sharing this as basically a history, but the point simply is it really wrecked Christianity in a lot of ways. And what's happened simply is that people have actually have dropped out of these particular groups because the whole idea has always been major on the second coming of Jesus. You see, that's what it's about. And part of it's also part of their particular perspective of eschatology, that Jesus is coming soon. Okay, that's what they've been promoting. And you'll find out if you listen to sometimes in radio in the South, there are plenty of AM radios stations that broadcast fundamentalist preachers, although now it's not as prevalent. The fire has gone out, so to speak, for these groups. We're going to go into reading here and try to give a little bit more explanation of what has happened. And we're going to go back in the past. But one of the biggest things that happened was the Scopes trial. That's where basically before then it was the highest mark basically of the fundamentals, although they still continued and they they went into other different groups, that is, at that point. So this is called This Age and the Millennium, Prologue, Chapter 4, called The Paradox of Revivalist Fundamentalism. This is meant for those who have an open head and a heart to look at these things. So, fundamentalism was a mosaic of divergent and sometimes contradictory traditions and tendencies that could never be totally integrated. And by the way, I would say others would be involved. I just forgot. Would be Jerry Falwell's church would be enormously involved. There is also the Akron, Ohio Temple at one time. I can't remember what it is. It's no longer. It's gone. The building is there still, but no one goes there anymore. They were active. That I watched a little bit of a documentary on it yesterday. It's kind of interesting. At one time, this is key. they had a bus ministry. So they would pick up people all around the area of Akron. That's true of where we went to church in Mooresville, North Carolina, with a church called Eastside Baptist Church. They had a bus ministry, you see, to bring in either, basically a lot of it was to do with young children. When their parents could not come, or either they didn't want to come, but yet they wanted their children to go, they were picked up by the church bus deal. And that was a big deal. It's also other areas, but this was basically, they were all looking forward to Jesus coming. This was the big deal. And basically society began to wake up and realize that what's going on. Okay, hello. You know, if you're drawing, your big attraction is simply Jesus coming back, and you're putting almost everything on that. In fact, that's what they were doing. Your theology is out of whack in a lot of ways too, you see, because once that people begin to sense that, and others begin to feel it and realize something's not right here, people dissipated real quick, you see. So at times they seem ready to forsake the whole world over a point of doctrine. Yeah, they're very, very, very big on this, definitely. At other times they appeared heedless of tradition in their zeal to win converts. Sometimes they were optimistic patriots. In other words, they were involved with, trying to save America, you see. Sometimes they were prophets shaking from their feet the dust of the doomed civilization. It seemed as though they were always moving from one area to the other, so to speak. They were trying to save their country. And they were actively involved in politics too, very much so. It's not a put down. It's just basically a history of what's happened, and with that, we can try to learn from that. You see, their attitudes towards intellect, ideas, and systems of ideas reflected this pervasive ambivalence. On the one hand, a major element in the movement, well developed in 19th century revivalism, was the subordination of all other concerns, including concern for all but the simplest ideas, to soul saving and practical Christianity. So this soul saving was that they were trying to save souls. That's what they were doing. That was a big deal by far. And practical, that's their approach. They were what I would call, they didn't use the baptism was important, yes, but that was somewhat secondary. They seemed to be just caught up in this whole idea, and there were many of these people who were well known on shortwave radio. Right, they still are. There's one that was in Orangeburg, South Carolina here. I can't think of his name now. He's passed away about 2 or 3 years. I've actually had a communique with someone who was involved in that at one time, left. I guess probably 8 or 10 years ago, maybe longer. Anyway, I kind of got off on a tangent here. So, including concerns for all but the simplest. Okay, where were that? Okay, D.L. Moody stood in this camp. To Moody, most formally, ideas seemed divisive, and hence all but the least controversial were to be avoided. The stance of some of his closest associates, however, was strikingly different on this point. Difference to see, D.L. Moody was more of a salesman. Just get the job done. That's just kind of, because he was a salesman. He was a shoe salesman. He actually ran a shoe store, so he was very practical, but he wasn't going to be involved in all kinds of controversy. So the stance of some of his closest associates, however, was strikingly different on this point. The difference came out clearly in the survey conducted in 1899 by the Record of Christian Work, a Moody publication. A number of prominent evangelists were asked, quote, what was the teaching of Christ regarding his disciples, attitude towards error, and towards those who held erroneous doctrines, end quote. Reuben A. Torrey, Torrey, one of Moody's best known lieutenants, responded with a unmistakable fundamentalist answer. Quote, Christ and his disciples immediately attacked, exposed, and denounced error. We are constantly told in our day that we ought not to attack error, but simply teach the truth. This is the method of the coward and the trimmer. It was not the method of Christ. So they're taking that particular perspective. D.L. Moody also answered could hardly have been more directly opposed. Christ's teachings was always constructive. His method of dealing with this, these are his quotes here. His method of dealing with error was largely to ignore it, letting it melt away in the warm glow of the full intensity of truth expressed in love. Let us hold truth, but by all means, let us hold on to love and not with a theological club. In other words, not hitting someone over the head. See, behind these two answers lay not only contrasting personalities, but different basic assumptions concerning the importance of ideas and such. Both approaches are important to an understanding of the resulting movement. Moody's approach showed one side of the revivalist heritage. Torrey, on the other hand, represented part of a major organizing force in fundamentalism that, far from rejecting the intellect, assigning vast importance to ideas, the tendency is nowhere seen more clearly than in the commitment of such leaders as Torrey to dispensational premillennialism. So what is dispensationalism? Well, dispensationalism is an approach to what they see, how God acted at certain times in the Bible. And this would be one of his dispensations would be that he would be involved here. What is what we call the dispensation, being, we say simply is how they look at it, that God was very serious when supposedly dealt with the ark with Noah. And he was not going to tolerate anybody else as such and such. The problem is that's not God. You see, the Old Testament is speaking of another character in the Bible. Some would say Yahweh, or another better word would be simply is the Creator. And so the Creator is very jealous of everything around him, which would be revealed simply is that he lacked control. In other words, he wanted to have control of everything. And this is what people miss, you see, part of it. We also see a different perspective. We also see the law is a big deal in the Old Testament, so to speak, also with the 10 Commandments, you see. But people don't realize simply is that that's not really the point, so to speak. But that becomes a point with these guys. You see, they chose these areas they wanted to pick on to make it highlight them, and then other areas that didn't make any, didn't deal with that. And then you have actually today, most pastors in the past would talk about a lot of things with Old Testament, fiery, anger, all that type of stuff. And they would use that to make people fearful. Okay. We use that in their sermons to scare people to death. When some of the Israelites were in the desert area with their in the wilderness, a group basically got in trouble, and supposedly the earth opened up, and these people fell in it. You see, but that's again taking it literal. You see, but we have to understand simply is that the Bible is not a literal book, but that's the biggest stumbling block for everybody out there. So we see an age of the law, and we have an age of grace, such and such, so to speak. And basically, that's from the Old and New Testament. Let's continue on here. The contrast between Moody and his dispensationalist associates points towards a feature of later fundamentalism and helps to explain some characteristics that otherwise seem contradictory. Not only did the later movement involve an alliance between revivalists in the pious tradition and denominational conservatives, that is conservationists, not conservatives, in the Calvinist teachings, that is tradition, especially as represented by the Princeton theology. But within the revivalist wing itself, there was a thoroughgoing amalgamation that is much more than an alliance of these two traditions, the pious and the Calvinist. This amalgamation had been an important aspect of American revivalism since its origin in the Great Awakening, that is the 17th century. Puritanism had combined highly intellectual theology with intense piety. So I want to make some things clear here as he talks about. So Princeton is the last, what we call the conservative bastion, which is a Presbyterian seminary. It is considered at that time a very conservative school. And the rest in the Northeast, especially, is in New Jersey, that is Princeton. The key is simply is that the rest in the New England area have gone completely, in a way, they would say they've gone liberal. Okay. And so they are basically outgunned in some ways in the area. This is also, could be, we could say, the melting pot also of the New England is a key deal. You have a vast array of different people from different places in Europe that have settled there. Okay. You also have what we call massive cities. You have the city of New York City. You have the city of Philadelphia. You have the city of Boston. Those are probably the three biggest I can think of. And you have also, there's also cities also along in the state of Connecticut, also Hartford and Bridgeport, that type of thing. But there's an influx of different types of people there. And also, eventually, some people there eventually go out to the Midwest later. You know, they will choose to move on. But the first ground was such and such was in this northeastern pocket. You don't see that at first to deal with the South until later on, which is what's not, the South is not really involved in this at this point, at that point. But later on, it is enormously involved. Okay. Because the Southern Baptist Church was involved here. You also have to understand that there's in South Carolina, a few other states like North Carolina, or the Episcopalians are here, or such and such. The Catholics are not really enormously powerful here in either one of these states whatsoever, unless they're in a large city. But the point is simply is that doesn't make sense because simply is that just more people coming in. You see, the Puritans had combined a highly intellectual theology with intense piety. The awakening of the 18th century introduced into a essentially Calvinistic context a new style of emotional intensity, personally commitment to Christ, and holy living inspired directly by German and Methodist pietism. Pietism simply means holiness. It's this, that's what comes across. In the unrestrained American environment, this union sprawled innumerable variations of Calvinism and Arminian theology, multiplied by countless varieties of denominational and revivalist emphasis. Yes, even the Calvinists and Arminians also got along in this area because this is what, this was about pietism, you see. And what we call Arminianism is probably would be mainly your two groups, what we call the Methodists and the Baptists. But that's not true today. That's all changed. The shifting sand, so to speak, has taken place in a lot of different groups. The Calvinists tend to stress intellect, the importance of right doctrine, the cognitive aspect of faith, and higher education. On the other hand, more pietism and emotional-oriented groups such as the Methodists tended to shun intellectual rigor and to stress the practical and experienced aspects of faith. Here's the key here. Here's talking about here. This is where the growth took place. This is where the growth took place in the Methodist Church. The Presbyterians were too highly involved in this, and this did not do well in the South. Okay, but you don't have brethren churches in the South. Also, we can talk about that. We don't have the Amish, although the Amish are not involved in this at all. Okay. The Mennonites are not involved because they're separatists. But what I'm trying to say simply is there was much more of what I would call the pie itself was more diverse up north than it was in the South. Okay, so your two major groups here with the strongest membership would be the Methodists and the Baptists, by far. But this was after a certain period of time, you see. At first, simply as it was Episcopalians, the Anglicans, at first, or Church of England, whichever way you want to call it. But that was it. What was settled, what we call settled in Charleston, so to speak. But that gradually changed, and as the land opened up, the you can see that Methodists and Baptists began to reap what we call more and more establishment of churches in the countryside. Yet many groups in America stress both the intellectual and the spiritual practical aspects. Many Congregationalists and Presbyterians, especially those of the revivalist branches known as the 19th century as the New School, end quote, combine educational and doctrinal emphasis with intense emotion. Jonathan Edwards was their model. Even, quote, old school, end quote, Presbyterians, including those at Princeton Seminary, renowned for their doctrinal conservatism and severe intellectual demand, had a place for sentiment and some pious leanings. The Baptists, who were less centralized and standardized, that is, had some similar pro-revivalist intellectual leaderships, but along with some distinctly non-intellectualism elements. The surge of revivalism associated with the rise of Charles Finney is in the 1820s, which developed in the New School, end quote, tradition, certainly did not forsake intellect, but it did create new channels for emphasis on emotions throughout American evangelism. Sandra Sizer, in her analysis of the rise of the gospel song, this is key, the gospel song in the 19th century America has suggested that Finney revivals marked the beginning of the attempt to build a new Christian community united in intense feelings. That's correct. That's definitely correct. So this churches like the Presbyterians are formalized. Their music is far more, I would say, somewhat we call dignified. It's usually with an organ. But after the Civil War, there's a tremendously change that takes place, especially with the Baptists and the Methodists. They're going to have the piano playing such and such. It's not, I'm not saying anything against it in some ways, but the point simply is there's a lot more singing going on and congregating, and to be joyful that they're in the body of Christ. Okay, that's kind of you get this feeling. It becomes in some ways like a little bit of a club, so to speak. Witnessing or testifying to one another about how God has transformed their lives was an important way in which these communities built themselves up and provided emotional support. Finney added emphasis on such meetings to his more or less conventional mass preaching services. But by the time of the remarkable businessmen revival of 1857 and 1858, the awakening itself originated in noon-hour prayer meetings, which were just such, quote, social religious meetings, end quote. Every new evangelical movement of this entire era through the rise of fundamentalism, and include the holiness, the Pentecostal, and the premillennial movements, had a base in some form of, quote, social religious, quote, gatherings. So I recall being in a Nazarene. So I've been in different churches in my life. I've been in a Baptist church, I've been in an independent Baptist church, I've been in a Nazarene church, I've been in a Grace Brethren church, I've been in a Presbyterian church. So I've been all different wide varieties of such and such. And I've actually, the Nazarenes are far more spirited. Someone who wants to speak, I can remember this very clearly, that would stand up in the church and start giving a testimony of what was going on in their life. It was an older man, and I was quite surprised at that because simply I'd never seen that before. I did not see that in a Baptist church. I didn't see that in an independent Baptist church in my life when I was going to a Nazarene church. So there was more of what I'm called the spirit was there, so to speak. And this was an older man. And there would be amens also along with that, you see. Now there was amens in other churches, but this was quite different. It had a feeling of this is Methodists are come backgrounds from Wesley, you see. And Wesleys were both from England, John and Charles, you see. And they broke away from the Episcopal Church. Most people don't know that. That Charles Wesley and John, both Charles, yeah, I'm getting this John, they both left. One was a great orator, so to speak, and the other one wrote songs, wrote tons and tons of songs. So the revivals of Moody and Sankey, Sizer argues persuasion in a sense applied the principles of the smaller group meetings on a massive scale. The use of a song leader, that's correct. That's right. My dad was a song leader at one time in the Nazarene church. He led songs. went up to the pulpit and said, let's turn to certain songs. And he would start out and start singing with the piano, you see, which Sankey made a lasting part of evangelism, was a conspicuous means of building emotional ties. This is what they're doing is simply is creating a positive reinforcement there. And this was a church in the city. It wasn't a city church. This wasn't in the country, you see. All right. Most common theme for the distress of sin to be relieved by a passionate surrender to the incredible love of Jesus. Hymns that told stories of prodigies, reclaim, and the like made the song itself a kind of witnessing. In contrast to 18th century hymns like those in the influential collection of Isaac Watts, the focus of revival songs shifted from praise to the awful majesty of God and the magnitude of his grace revealed in church atoning work, to the emotions of those who encounter the gospel. Similarly, Moody's sermons virtually abandoned all pretense and following conventional forms of explicitly explicating, I should say, a text, and were closer to layman's exhortation, meaning that the layman would be like a song leader who would actually exhort, let's sing this song over, okay? Filled with touching anecdotes with an emotional impact comparably to that of personal testimony. Yet the emphasis on a community of feeling seen here is only half the picture. Even if we look solely at the movement most clearly associated with Moody, 19th century American evangelism involved a definite belief system as well as a popular or rhetorical forms and strategics. Fundamentalism, as such, was concerned primarily with preserving the belief system, yet its proponents were equally concerned with promoting the popular forms, organizations, and strategies that were an inextricable part of the movement. Moody concerned himself primarily with the practical, less ideologically, and more pious side. Yet his lieutenant Torrey, and also Gray, Pearson, Gordon, and Blanchard, and Ertman, and Schofield added to that piety a strong interest in ideas, in the type of fundamentalism that grew out of their work. These two emphases on piety and on correct belief were fused, in their respective their movement showed characteristics that had been common to American Calvinist tradition since the First Great Awakening, indeed since the Puritans. In fact, the millennium, that is in brackets, or dispensational premillennial. So what does premillennial mean? It just simply means pre-mill. The millennium would be pre. In other words, Jesus would come back before the millennium, you see, movement. But strong Calvinist ties into American origins, that is. The movement immediately protege was John Nelson Darby, who's a key here. This is a key here, and this I think we need to understand who this guy is. Darby is from, he lived from 1800 to 1882, who broke with the Church of Ireland and became the leader of the separatist, what they call Plymouth Brethren group. This is where the brothers are all. This is where all that comes in from the brethren. This is all to do with. This took place at Keswick, England, I think it's called. But he's an Irishman. During his later career, Darby spent a great deal of time proselytizing in North America. So he was from that area, but he was coming here to America. You see, they were willing to come here, you see. He found relatively little interest there in the new Brethren set, but remarkably willingness to accept his views and methods of prophetic interpretations. This enthusiasm came largely from clergymen with strong Calvinistic views, principally the Presbyterians and the Baptists in the northern United States. And there's a big difference between Baptists in the north and the Baptists in the south, you see. And let's see, where am I at here? The evidence base for this affinity was that in most respects, Darby was himself an unrelenting Calvinist. His interpretation, I should say, of the Bible and of history rested firmly on the massive pillar of divine sovereignty, placing as little value as possible on human ability. So this is, you can see the bent here. This is what part of this is key for everybody to try to understand here. The organizers of the prophetic movement in America were predominantly Calvinists. In 1876, a group led by Nathan West, that is Nathaniel West, James H. Brooks, William J. Ertman, E-R-D-M-A-N, which is the Ertman Publishing Company, so I think it's connected, but don't hold me to that, and Henry M. Parsons, all Presbyterians, together with Baptist A.J. Gordon, initiate what would become known during the next quarter century as the annual Niagara Bible Conference for Prophetic Study. I don't know if they still meet or not, but that name stands out. That's in New York. That's in the upstate of New York. And to achieve wider publicity, virtually this same group in 1878 organized the first International Prophecy Conference, which became the model for similar conferences held every decade or so until the end of World War I. These early gatherings, which became the focal point for the prophetic side of their leaders' activities, were clearly Calvinist, Presbyterians, and Calvinist Baptists predominantly, while the number of Methodists was extremely small. A Calvinist movement with a strong interest in complex details of prophetic interpretation might have seemed contrary to prevailing trends of the day. Yes, it does. Even to revivalist evangelicals like D.L. Moody, who accepted the outlines of premillennialism, this doctrine rigor was unappealing to him. John Nelson Darby puzzled over how Moody could, on the one hand, accept the prophetic truths concerning God's sovereignty in history, and yet inconsistently allow room for a non-Calvinist view of human activity when it came to personal salvation. But Moody was more American, you see, or at least what is usually characterized as American. He preferred action to intellectual systems and freedoms to authoritarianism. The more perplexing question in how Moody's lieutenants, that is, as Americans, as he and quite popular as evangelism and pastors, could succeed so well in this American climate in promoting the complex system of dispensationalism. In fact, it was in the United States that the view of things, although imported from England, really took root. Even a century later, it continues to have immense appeal. The question is just how this set of ideas and emphasis fit into the American and evangelistic worldviews in order to be accepted as wide as it was. For a substantial number of Americans or American evangelicals, something in their outlook was conducive to the authoritarian and ideological character of dispensationalism, as well as to the sentiment and activism were usually associated with American revivalism. So let me just say something here. We look at all this whole thing about Jesus coming soon and all that type of thing, dispensationalism. It's like a carrot before a horse. It's always dangling. It's always getting attention. There would be people who would be talking about these things. Did you hear that? Israel's going to become a country, such and such, or all these things were tied into this type of thing. You see, that's what they were talking about. And a lot of the preachers later on, like Tim LaHaye, James Dobson, and others. Now, James Dobson was a Nazarene, as well as I recollect. Were involved in this immensely. They were on radio. Now, James Dobson's gone. His program was called Focus on the Family. Big. He had what we call almost the same effect that maybe we say, in some ways like Paul Harvey, but he wasn't. He was on Christian radio, or he was even sometimes on regular radio. You see, the intimate relationship between these two sides of emerging fundamentalism movement can be observed strikingly in Reuben A. Torrey, who lived from 1856 to 1928. Torrey came closest to being Moody's successor, rising to prominence as a world touring evangelist in the first decade of the 20th century. Torrey was one of the principal architects of fundamentalist thought. For someone who aspired to popularity, Torrey seemed to have been incongruently this pompous. As William McLaughlin put it, quote, on the street, he usually wore a high hat, and he always talked as though he had one on, end quote. A Congregationalist and a graduate of Yale, who has studied in Germany for a year, he was one of several leaders who represented the direct tie between fundamentalism and the New England tradition in which learning was so reverent. A sympathetic biography described him as almost immune to emotional persuasion. Quote, rather was he swayed by the logical element of cold reason, end quote. Another admirer said he did not, quote, remember his ever getting a laugh from any congregation, end quote. Torrey characterized his own preaching style as, quote, scholarly, end quote, and said that he thought of his approach as that, quote, of a lawyer, end quote, before a jury. A counterpoint to this somewhat unpromising approach to mass evangelism, in brackets, although it must be remembered that Charles Finney also described himself as a, quote, lawyer-like preacher, in bracket, was Torrey's singing partner, that is Charles Alexander, that is Charlie, who was less formal than Sankey, represented the religion of the heart to the same extent that Torrey's style suggested a religion of the mind. And this is what we see. There's a battle going on in the late 1800s. After the war, this all changed dramatically. Sunday school was introduced, you see. As far as I know, there was no such Sunday school before these time periods. Also, after the war, there was there's a break between the South and North, naturally, so to speak. There were people who actually, during the war, separated from their own denominations, okay, because of the war, okay. There were certain churches that left and became Southern Presbyterians. That's why you have, in some ways, called the Southern Baptists. Now, I can't say the Southern Baptists did the same things. I can't say that because I can't remember that in my mind. That's what I was taught. So a counterpoint to this somewhat unpromising approach to mass evangelism. That is, although it must be remembered that Charles Finney also described himself. Okay, I've got off the tangent here wrong. Naturally, we'll have to describe these methods as the techniques of a master of ceremonies as a Rotary convention, end quote. Naturally, these two complementary each other, that is, with Alexander always the more popular, but Torrey, that is in brackets, who in principle favored heart religion and talked a great deal about the Holy Spirit, in bracket, providing the intellectual backbone. This relationship between heart and intellect almost always characterized the central individuals and groups in the emerging fundamentalist movement. At least 75% of the fundamentalists talked and writing was devoted to popular piety, simply Bible study, and soul winning, themes that one might associate with Moody, Sankey, or Alexander. The other 25%, however, gave the movement its distinctive characteristics and distinguished it from a general revivalist trend of which it was a part. These distinguishing features need to be explained, especially some rather remarkable intellectual traits and assumptions. For understanding these and for understanding their relationship to American culture, the growth of dispensational premillennialism within the larger revivalism and anti-liberal movements offers some more intriguing clues. So I was thinking of something. That's the end of the chapter here, chapter 4. But I'm thinking about simply is when I was in Sunday school in an independent Baptist church in Athens, Georgia. The pastor there was in Athens, Georgia. So Athens is a growing city at that point. This is in the 60s. My dad was working for a company called General Times. Naturally, Athens, Georgia is also where the University of Georgia is located at, a big university at that time. But I remember some of the songs we sang, and they like one was called Deep and Wide, basically what they call the love of Jesus. It was deep and it was wide, so to speak. You use hand signals too. This is how the teachers were. Deep and wide. You got the children sort of involved. And that's one of the things I remember. I remember the families there. I do remember some of the families also. We were only there for about a year and a half. And my dad transferred to North Carolina. But anyway, I'm rambling a little bit more here, and I don't want to do that. So thank you for listening. Again, this was chapter 4, Fundamentalism and American Culture. Thank you. You take care.